my joy to be with Professor Rothney Tshaka, a friend and colleague, and from the University of South Africa. And Rothney, thanks for being available to talk on this little video podcast. You've seen a few on the web, so you know the quality is not intended to be professional. It's not a lecture; it's just a thought.
Good though.
But Rothney, thanks for being willing to speak to us today. And I wonder if I could begin by asking you just to tell us a little bit about your own theological interests and your particular emphasis within theology.
Yes. Well, thanks, Dion, and thank you for letting us have this conversation. Well, let me just start off by saying I started theology at the University of the Western Cape, where I was also involved in a ZASCO at the time. I completed my undergraduate degree there, then moved to Stellenbosch as part of the great move of the URC theological education to Stellenbosch.
That was in 2000.
That was in 2000.
Okay.
Yeah, quite some time ago. And so I did some of my postgraduate studies. I did a PhD on the theology of Calvert and how it relates or speaks to the Bella situation. And after that, I went into various things, working in Zimbabwe, in the US, and came back here. But what has been very, very interesting for me was the kinds of things that my theological concept was able to let me do. A chief of that would be to deal with issues or the intersections between theology, politics, and the race question. Okay. And those are the kinds of things that I am very much interested in. I have published quite a few papers on the intersections of black theology and African theology, because if you're acquainted with that, you would know that there's also some tensions between the two. And so,
well, why don't we stop there just for a moment, and maybe you can just tell us a little bit about the sort of distinctives and differences of each of these two schools or discourses in contemporary theology.
Absolutely. Well, black theology is a theology that was brought into existence because of the then racist and apartheid structures. So black theology focused more on political inclusion.
Okay.
So it means the question of blackness is not an antithesis. In fact, being black does not mean that you are therefore not a human being. So you have the likes of Busaks and the South African cohort being on that side mostly. But the difference between black theology and African theology is that African theology tends to emphasize not only political inclusion, but also say there should be some democracies in terms of cultures, so that you don't have only one particular culture dominating a conversation, but that you should go to African cultures and also include them in that. But what I am arguing is that it is actually it is just leisure. It is simply, we don't have the time as black and African theologians to have these binaries, but to say there are issues that are both political and cultural that has to be central in the discourse that is aimed at dealing with the lived experiences of black people. Instead of seeing them as antithesis or being in opposition to one another, I'm saying that they both need one another for them to meaningfully impact the lives of black people or African people, on the continent and elsewhere.
Okay. Now, Rothney, I really, and I've read and cited many of your works in my own thinking, and one of the issues that has become, quite important in my own thinking, and you've helped me to think through that quite carefully, is the dominance of Western thought in theology and the dominance of whiteness, even in Southern African theologies. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about that.
Yes. Well, I think I must just first preface that by saying race is quite an emotive thing, and I find that many people tend to not continue in the conversation on race because they feel that it becomes too emotional. That's one point. But also it's important for us to understand that Western epistemologies and pedagogies tend to be pervasive still, and these are ways of knowledge production that does not allow knowledge production on the periphery, for instance. I mean, if your worldview is informed by Western epistemologies and by Western forms of teaching, then there's no way that should really allow for an integration of African or alternative epistemologies and pedagogies to sort of frame context for engagement or knowledge production today. And so we have to admit that as part of our drive to critique and to question a particular dominance of one form of knowledge production. And I also get to the point that the issue of whiteness is one thing that for a long time was never subject for discussion. People have studied black, etc., because whiteness has always been the norm. And when there's something is a norm, there is no point for you to critique that until very recently. Where people have begun to say people have to look at whiteness as a real issue. Now, back in the days, there was a book by Tandeka. This is a person the name was given to him by Desmond Tutu, who writes a book called Learning to be White. In essence, saying instead of looking at the other, this supposedly norm has to begin to critique itself, because these are things that are learned. But it's more than that also, it's attitudes. And it's an attitude that is premised on the understanding that everything outside of it is to be denied. And it speaks of arrogance as well. So it's not only, color is not, you can have people who are white who understand how problematic whiteness is. But it's more the challenges that comes with the arrogance of whiteness in maintaining that the narratives of those outside of it are not as important as that. So that's more, that's the aspect that I always feel the need to explain, because many people retreat from this conversation. And I said to you yesterday, by virtue of the fact that some people feel they can just withdraw from the conversation, especially white folk, speaks to that arrogance, and speaks also to the fact that they have got white power in that they have options. While the black person actually don't have an option but to be in this conversation. And then we have to understand also the ways that are used by black folk, whether they be right or wrong, as to why is it that they engage in this, because they have no option. Than the white colleague could have, who decides that I'm fed up with this race talk and I'm going to retreat to my spaces where he or she is still comfortable. So I think people have to look at it in that way, that you are not helping yourself by withdrawing from the conversation. It's important for you to understand that these issues, which as South African, can only be dealt with by South Africans, and we have to begin to not only affirm but to recognize that there are some narratives that are not part of the main narrative. Hence some of the reactions that you see around the country today.
Now, Rothney, I made a little video a couple of weeks ago about what I termed subversive theologies or subversive ethics, and made the point that very often what we regard as the norm, the sort of universal theology or universal ethic, is unquestioned because it's supported by dominance and power. And what we need is a sort of a disruption that moves us closer to truth. Is it fair to say that in some senses black theology and African theology and even theologies of liberation help us in that regard?
Well, I think absolutely that's true. In fact, my understanding of black theology is that it is a means towards a particular end. It is not an end in itself, but it says for as long as there is white racism that is entrenched in structures, there is a need for the black person to begin to accept and understand and accept himself in his black skin, and for him to begin to think and relate to God in a way that he does not feel estranged to that God. And this was necessitated precisely because of a creation of a particular God that seemed to favor a particular racial group, as opposed to another one. So there would have been no black theology had what is known today as a dominant theology not constructed an image and an understanding of what it means to be a true human being. And by that then saying others who don't fall into that category are not human beings. So people are afraid for black theology for not proper reasons really, because for them, I suppose, there's a particular imagery that is conjured up when people speak black, and it also speaks to how when you have something that claims to be the universal truth, and if whiteness is the norm, how it feels threatened by anything outside of it affirming itself. That's the problem. People because of the status quo, people are afraid that once you begin to assert yourself and to affirm yourself, that is perceived to be problematic. The same example can be made to the gay question, for instance. I mean, who would have, and of course, some people would be happy with gay people if they are just silent and know their place, but not be too loud, not be too pink, etc., etc. The same thing applies to that as well. that black people are okay if they are just accepting their position and not being too loud. Don't agitate too much. Then become problems.
Yeah.
We would appreciate them if they know their place and their spaces and just don't come and agitate elsewhere.
Yeah.
And the ones who believe or think like that are always the ones in positions of power.
Yeah.
The ones who believe that they are the ones who are supposed to think on their behalf.
Yeah.
You see, and so these are some of the issues that I try to engage in my scholarship. Yeah.
Now, the one thing I want to ask you about, Rothney, which let's just get us both in the picture there. I'm trying to work out which side is which. Rothney, the one thing I want to ask you about is we spoke a little bit yesterday about the necessity sometimes for discomfort.
Sure.
And even conflict.
Sure.
Because I've seen many times that when we become so comfortable with power and a particular position, and particularly when you're empowered, as you said earlier, you can withdraw from conflict and avoid it. Tell me about the importance of necessary discomfort and even necessary conflict to resolve some of these difficult issues.
Dion, I can only refer to my own personal situation. I find that all the people that I consider to be in good relations with, be they black or white, I consider them truly my friends because there was a point in time where we had to disagree. And therefore I had to understand that we are both I am an individual, I have got my own thinking, etc., etc. But I find that in a spirit of niceness, in the spirit of being politically correct, people avoid confrontational issues, and with the hope that if we don't deal with it now, time is going to heal that. In time, all is going to be well. And I find that is actually not helping us deal with the problems. And I must say, of my alma mater, I find that we are very nice and we want to deal things in a nice way, but I don't think that we are healing. That there should be a rupture. There's some African proverbs that speak of when you have a sore, it must be broken first before it starts to heal. And I don't think we have come to that point yet.
Yes.
And I appreciate a lot of positive things, many proactive stances and positions that were taken. However, I think it is important that we begin to say, let's deal with the elephant in the room. Let us point it out and let us deal with it. And I think in time it will just make us a better thing. I also want to say this as a last part to this. Being religious, being people of faith, sometimes the issue of hope is thrown into this conversation like a cat among pigeons. We are forced to say, in as much as we're dealing with issues, where's the hope? I tend to believe that hope and true hope is derived from honest and robust debates about issues.
It's authentic in a sense.
That is hope in itself. You don't have to say, well, but this is the panacea, let's just throw it in like that. No. Hope is derived from us being shut down because we have dealt with the issues that had all of us, and then from there find a amicable way of making sure that we can face the world tomorrow. But once you enter discourse with the proviso that says there need to be hope, it becomes problematic, it becomes artificial, because you are then forced into a particular corner because you have to satisfy this condition. But I say, me and you having robust exchange on narratives of this country, for me that's hopeful enough. Yeah, I see that as the greatest hope, that we can talk about these issues, and when you can talk about anything, the sky is the limit.
We can find one another and find something worthwhile together, not something artificial.
It's important to be yourself. To be yourself and let your white brother and sister or black brother and sister understand that this is yourself. Instead of putting on facades that say the world is looking at us and therefore we have to act accordingly. I mean, we have seen that with the so-called rainbow nation of this country. How that was just clearly a big lie, because it has prevented us to deal with issues so that we can move on from there. Not move on because one feels uncomfortable, but both of us who are in that position having admitted that we have dealt with these issues, let us find ways of moving up. You know.
I have a sense, and I also, by the way, Rothney, I made a video about that particular one, sort of deconstructing those narratives, and I have a sense that they're used to silence change and to stop people from engaging with truthful things. We live in a future that will never exist, or we cling to a past that never was real.
Absolutely.
And that's not helpful. Rothney, one final question, maybe just to ask you, if you could suggest perhaps some of your own work or any other works that you think students or colleagues might read to help to initiate them into some of these conversations. What can you mention off the top of your head?
Good. Some years ago, I remember I made a statement here that sometimes when people say, where is the literature? It is not because they have gone out to check for the literature, but it's a way of saying, because you don't have literature, you can't talk, you can't speak on this matter. And there is literature. Like I'm thinking of, you know, there's many people that come to mind. Kofi Asare Opoku is a, you know, I find him to be a great African philosopher who help us to deal with these issues of alternative epistemologies and pedagogies. There is the Eritrean African philosopher Tanai Serakorbam, who also deal with these issues of the alternate, of the peripheral, you know, knowledge production, and how that can just influence, you know, the current discourses that we're having. I can think of the likes of Simon Maimela, who used to be associated with the University of South Africa. Alan Busa, of course, is known here. You know, there are recent guys like Verne Velem, for instance, who also does critical scholarship with regards to this. And I think, you know, perhaps it's important for an institution like the Faculty of Theology here to have a bibliography that is intentionally and deliberately meant to expose, you know, students to these kinds of scholars.
Absolutely.
You know, I've worked already with something like that for my college at the University of South Africa, where we just looked at a bibliography that we populate and circulate among the college so that people can acquaint themselves with this. Not only have I done that, but I've bought books on also, you know.
I see that on Facebook from time to time. I admire your books.
Yeah. But it shows you the mind is in the right place. It just needs some time. And once I get my time, I'm going to have some time to go through some of this. But I think a start would be to force, well, I don't like to use the word force, but to encourage students to have a bibliography of African scholars.
And we mustn't take the sort of easy way out and say there is no literature. There is literature.
Exactly. I say there is literature. It's always there.
Yeah.
But it's just important that you have people who have the will to nudge things into the right position so that things can happen. And I appreciate some of the white young students here. I was so impressed with their eagerness to engage in some of these issues. You know, it shows you that we are socialized into things, and when people have the opportunity to really want to understand that which they were deprived of, I'm amazed at the eagerness that I've seen in today's proceedings so far, and I'm very much happy, you know, for the likes of you guys who continue to say, you know, we can do this together, you know. And it doesn't also mean that you don't have the right to critique, to criticize, because, you know, nothing is cast in stone. You know, truth is derived in conversation. We don't know the truth, but it is derived in conversation, so that we can both then agree to what is the best thing and the best way to go forward.
Rothney, it's been fantastic to talk with you, and just to say to our listeners, I'll put some links to Rothney's work on the University of South Africa website. I know they have a collection of your work, and Rothney, we're so grateful for you and for all you're doing and for helping us along the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, indeed, it's been a very fruitful conversation, and I'll get one or two of the names of some of the authors that Rothney has suggested and stick them in the show notes. So thanks for watching today, and Rothney, thanks again for being here. I appreciate it.